The Ferrari Challenger is finally here. We finally get a look at the SF24. That is the official name for this car. And we get to finally have a look at the official car of this with some beautiful renders. And I might have to say that this is the most beautiful livery that I've seen from Ferrari in a very long period of time. And that's saying a lot considering we had the F175. I loved last year's livery as well, but yeah, this livery is just top notch. But the actual car itself is 95% different. That was the claims coming into this, and that's what's still being talked about. So there is so much to go over. There is so much to cover. Let's go into everything that we need to know for the SF24 going into the 2024 season for Formula One. And if you're new here, please give it a like, subscribe. It would mean the world for me. I mean, the channel has been growing amazingly, so thank you all so much for the support. Let's get into the SF24, and as we know, we start off from the front wing. So, I mean, Ferrari always provides the best renders for their car, and they provide exactly what is on the car, so there is so much to dive into and delve deep into. So let's start off with the front wing, as I said. As we're starting off on the front wing, they have a couple different sponsors, but that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at what is the aerodynamic upgrades and what has the car brought to itself. Now this front wing is different. The first thing you're going to notice, at least from last year's car, is it doesn't have those dividers like it did in its 2023 version. Now, I didn't think this was something that was going to stay. No other team really adopted those dividers. I don't think it's that much of an aerodynamic change. Maybe it's a little too heavy on the front wing. I'm not exactly sure, but they went away from that concept, and they've actually changed now the nose. Nose is now closer to what the AMR 24 has, and so does the RB19, with that divided first plate wing, where they're trying to send more of that airflow to the underfloor. I think this is also another common thing that we're going to see amongst cars, because Ferrari and Aston Martin and Mercedes of last year, they had their nose all the way coming down all the way to the bottom to its last front wing flap, but now it's just a divided front wing flap to where they have these little stakes holding up that front wing flap. But overall, the actual shape of the front wing has changed as well. They've always gone for a pretty skinny front wing. I'd say that they have, if not the skinniest front wing on the grid usually, and I think that trend continues. It's got a little bit of a different pattern to it. It isn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be much more Red Bull-esque, but still, most of these front wings are starting to straight line themselves out and have more outwash rather than inwash. And this is still continuing down that trend, even from this view. But that overall with this front wing, now some parts of the outwash have changed with how they've done that little part right in between the end plate and the wing flaps. It's changed just by the slightest bits, but nothing too much to really dive deep into. But the overall setup from this nose going into the car and the suspension has definitely added a couple of wishbones onto it to make this more aerodynamically inclined. Now, this is another team that hasn't switched over to the pull rod suspension. This is still a push rod suspension for this car, and you can't really tell from this picture, but I'm pretty sure this car has added more anti-dive onto it and actually brought up those wishbones from what it was before. But it's always been a pretty strong car in the braking zone, so that's not something that I think Ferrari needs to worry about too much. As we continue looking from this view, you can see that the side pod inlets have changed, and we don't really have too much onto the halo, but this was something that they were talking about is like an aerodynamic revolution, at least, to their halo car. So I'd like to see where that actually is, because I don't really see much, but there is a couple of things to look at with the way that the halo falls down and then the way you look into the engine cover. It is a bit different to other cars, and I think from a side view, we'll be able to look at this better. So let's go and look at the side view. So looking at it from a straight up side view. Now this car is a lot different from the side. First things we're going to notice, now these pictures aren't exactly the brightest in some certain spots, especially under the actual side pod design itself, but you can see the side impact structure. You can see that new area that they have instead of it being into the side pod, which was something we knew was going to get changed. You can see that now this car is completely downwashed in comparison to before. Before it was still a inwash concept, now it is actually definitely a downwashing concept, and the actual engine cover, rear wing have all changed. Rear wing has much more bigger of a cutout. They did kind of introduce this, but this is now probably one of the biggest cutouts that I've seen in a rear wing. And the actual engine cover itself actually extends from the halo all the way to the back of the car. This was not on the car before, even with its inwashing concept. It still had a very odd layout, but the actual cooling gills do seem to be in the same spot as well. And the way that carbon fiber is laid out, at least in this picture, it almost doesn't look like there's any depth to that, but there's a lot more depth to it when we look at the car from a upper view. So let's look at it from an above view. Now, looking at this car from an above view, this gives you a great example of how much the car has changed, at least in this type of way when it comes to engine cover and side pod. So side pod design, as I said, it is now fully downwashing and the engine cover extends to the back. Cooling gills are pretty much in the same spot, and they've kept the way that engine cover cooling inlet looks the same. It's still got that V type of shape to it. Haas actually went pretty further away from it, so I was shocked to see Ferrari keep it, but traditional Ferrari keeping it. And then here is where you can see the actual halo design. The way that it's set up is much different to other cars on the grid. It's not something that I've really seen commonly on the grid, with this kind of little layout to force the air to go towards, I guess, into that engine cover direction, but kind of go maybe above this S duct that they have. They kept the S duct. It's very hidden and you can't really see it as well in most of the renders, but you can see where the outlet is. So they've kept this part of the design, which I find pretty shocking, but still, it's true. They kept it. That was also in the reports that they were going to keep the S duct. They kept it. But now with some, I would say, very slight water slides, they're nothing to the level of the Aston Martin. The Aston Martin is so extreme, and Alpine is pretty extreme as well, but this car is somewhat keeping it. I think, actually, funny enough, the Red Bull leaked today. It was pictures from the Silverstone running, and I think they're rumored to have slide pods as well, so maybe this is just a continuous trend that Aston Martin started. Well, Alpine technically started it, but it does seem to be going into that direction, and the Ferrari does have them slightly. It's way less of a degree, and it just slightly goes into it towards the rear of the car, but that's a complete change to what they previously had on their car. And as you can look from the top here as well, I do think that layout for the suspension has changed as well. But I mean, what Haas had, they have as well. Haas took both the front and the rear suspension, and they still have that pull rod suspension in the back. They're one of the only cars that has a pull rod rear suspension. And that to me is pretty shocking, because it seems like the push rod rear suspension is a very important part that a lot of teams are implementing, but when it comes to top speed, this team wasn't lacking it. It was very good, and its diffuser and how much output was coming from the underfloor for the top speed was very efficient. So I still think they have a small gearbox, but it makes issues aerodynamically in the car and stability-wise. So they must have changed the layout to help with this aerodynamically. But let's talk about now the rear of the car. So looking at it from here, you can kind of see those slight indentations in those pontoons, is what it's being called really for when I say slide pods. Just slightly, you can see it, but you can see that it's not really there to much of a degree. It's way more Red Bull-esque than it is AMR-esque. And you can see how big the cutout is from this view specifically. And you can see how major they've done those sides of the rear wing, pulling it all the way out, but actually keeping that flat upper flap for the DRS. It's much more even skinnied than I thought last year. I mean, these rear wings are getting so tiny and so precise. It's really a thing of beauty seeing what teams are doing with this car. You can see it also a little bit better from here. The actual rear wing itself hasn't changed drastically, but this also gives you a better view of how the S-duct comes in and the engine cover itself with that little interesting halo design that they've made that no other team has really followed, I think, on the grid. The actual floor itself has also changed by the slightest bit, but it's not a major change. I think the floor will be a lot more visible when we see it on the actual real car rather than the renders. Overall, this car has changed a lot. The actual layout of the car is completely different, and as they say, 95% of this car has changed. I really do believe that Ferrari this year can take it to a different level, because this is the team that I think genuinely probably has the best chance at challenging when it comes to overall speed. They were fast in the straight line. I think that's where every team is kind of lacking, and they were kind of figuring it out with the DRS efficiency. And overall, their car was performing, I would say, the best in 22 and 23 when the conditions were right. They had the most consistent car, at least to me, because of the type of design that they had. But now changing the overall platform, they have really changed a lot, and let's see if Ferrari can take it to that next level. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.